Hook, what if one of America's most experienced television journalists suddenly abandoned the usual celebrity-friendly questions and instead challenged every major claim made by one of the world's most controversial public figures? Imagine an interview that begins with polite smiles, carefully rehearsed answers, and the polished atmosphere viewers expect from morning television, only to transform into a tense exchange where every response raises even more difficult questions. According to this dramatized scenario, that's exactly what happened when George Stephanopoulos sat down with Meghan Markle for what was expected to be a routine promotional interview, but quickly became something far more intense. As the conversation unfolded, the atmosphere inside the studio reportedly changed. The comfortable introductions disappeared, replaced by probing questions that caught everyone off guard. By the end of today's story, you'll understand why this fictional confrontation has generated so much discussion online. Let's get into it. The calm before the storm. Good Morning America studio looked exactly as viewers would expect. Bright lighting, professional cameras, a polished set. Everything suggested another carefully managed celebrity interview. George Stephanopoulos greeted Meghan warmly, thanked her for appearing, and opened with what sounded like a thoughtful question. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but experienced interviewers often save their toughest questions until the audience feels comfortable. And that's exactly where this conversation reportedly took an unexpected turn. George acknowledged that Meghan had spoken publicly many times about her experiences, her personal struggles, and what she often described as her truth. Then he asked a question few expected. He wondered whether difficult emotional experiences could sometimes influence the way people remember events. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't an interruption. It was a question about perspective. For a brief moment, Meghan appeared surprised. Instead of continuing with prepared talking points, she paused before responding. She insisted that she had always spoken honestly about her personal experiences and rejected any suggestion that her memories were unreliable. The interview had suddenly shifted direction. A different kind of interview. George remained calm. His tone never became aggressive. Instead, he leaned further into the discussion. He explained that personal experiences are important, but that every person's recollection can sometimes be shaped by emotion, stress, or the passage of time. His point was simple. When public accusations carry enormous consequences, journalists have a responsibility to ask difficult follow-up questions. That statement immediately raised the tension inside the conversation. Meghan argued that questioning her recollections risked minimizing experiences she believed were genuine. She suggested that challenging her account echoed the very treatment she had previously described receiving, but George pushed back. He clarified that asking for clarification wasn't the same as dismissing someone's experiences. Instead, he argued that responsible journalism requires testing important claims rather than simply accepting them at face value. The discussion had officially moved beyond promotion. Now, it was accountability, the question that changed everything. George then introduced one of the most controversial subjects connected to Meghan's previous interviews. He referred to allegations involving concerns about her son Archie's skin color. Rather than debating whether the conversation occurred, George focused on something else. Why had the individual allegedly involved never been publicly identified? According to the scenario, George argued that leaving such a serious allegation unnamed allowed widespread speculation while preventing any clear accountability. In his view, millions of people were left to guess. Entire institutions became associated with accusations without specific evidence being presented publicly. Meghan strongly defended her decision. She explained that identifying someone could have caused enormous personal harm. She believed withholding the name demonstrated restraint rather than avoidance. But George wasn't convinced. He questioned whether protecting anonymity had actually protected anyone, or whether it simply allowed broader suspicion to spread unchecked. The exchange became noticeably more intense. Every answer seemed to generate another difficult question. The pressure built as the conversation continued. Meghan maintained that she had answered previous interview questions honestly and had never intended to damage anyone. George acknowledged that intention matters, but he argued that consequences matter too. he questioned whether serious public allegations also carry a responsibility to provide as much clarity as possible. The atmosphere inside the studio reportedly grew increasingly uncomfortable. Camera operators remained focused, crew members watched silently. Even viewers at home could sense that this no longer resembled a routine morning television interview. George then shifted the conversation again. He raised Meghan's descriptions of feeling unsupported during her time within the royal family. She spoke about isolation, intense public scrutiny, and institutional failures that she believed affected her well-being. George listened carefully, but instead of moving on, he challenged the broader narrative. He noted that she had entered one of the world's most privileged institutions with significant resources, international recognition, and unprecedented opportunities. Then came another difficult question. Did disappointment with royal life eventually evolve into public criticism of the institution itself? Or were those criticisms always inevitable? The discussion had reached an entirely new level. Neither participant appeared willing to back away, and the toughest questions were still ahead. The conversation turns even sharper with the atmosphere already tense. George wasn't finished. Instead of moving to a safer topic, he shifted toward another issue that had fueled years of public debate: preparation. According to the scenario, George questioned Meghan's repeated statements about entering royal life without fully understanding what it would involve. He pointed out that her relationship with Prince Harry had lasted for a significant period before their engagement. During that time, countless documentaries, books, interviews, and public records about royal traditions had been available. His question was straightforward. Could someone truly enter one of the most documented institutions in the world without knowing what to expect? Meghan answered immediately. Reading about royal life, she argued, is nothing like living it. Anyone can research protocols, traditions, and ceremonies, but no article can prepare someone for constant media attention, endless public criticism, or the pressure of representing one of the world's most recognizable families. She insisted there was a world of difference between theory and reality. George acknowledged that point. Experience and research, he agreed, are not identical. But then he added something that immediately redirected the conversation. Let's examine a few specific examples. The bridesmaid story returns one of the most widely discussed stories surrounding Meghan's time before the royal wedding involved Catherine, Princess of Wales. For years, headlines debated exactly what happened during a disagreement over bridesmaids' dresses. According to this dramatized exchange, George revisited that controversy. He questioned why different versions of the story had appeared over time. If misunderstandings had eventually been resolved privately, why had public perception been allowed to develop in another direction? The question lingered. For several seconds, Meghan reportedly remained silent. The pause itself became part of the interview. Finally, she explained that emotions had been running high before the wedding: planning pressures, intense media attention, constant scrutiny. She maintained that she had tried to protect what she believed was a private family disagreement rather than escalate it publicly. George wasn't entirely satisfied. He argued that delays in correcting public misunderstandings can still affect reputations. Even if there was no harmful intention, inaccurate public narratives can have lasting consequences. His focus wasn't simply on who cried. His focus was accountability. When millions of people hear one version of events, does the responsibility exist to correct the record as quickly as possible? That question hung heavily in the studio. Credibility under the spotlight. As the discussion continued, George emphasized that credibility isn't built only on telling a story, it's also built on consistency. He suggested that changing details, even unintentionally, can cause audiences to question larger claims. Meghan strongly disagreed. She argued that surviving intense public pressure isn't a simple, linear experience. People remember different details over time. Context changes, perspective evolves. She insisted that none of that meant she had deliberately misled anyone. Instead, she described herself as someone trying to navigate extraordinary circumstances while facing relentless criticism from every direction. For a brief moment, the conversation slowed, but only briefly, because George moved to another topic that many viewers considered even more sensitive. The mental health discussion's interview reportedly shifted toward Meghan's public comments about her mental health. George acknowledged the seriousness of those claims. He made it clear that struggles involving mental health deserve compassion and should never be dismissed. But he followed with another difficult question. If someone believes they're facing a mental health crisis, why wait for institutional approval before seeking professional help? A new line of questioning beat the stage. The interview had completely departed from the polite tone that usually defines morning television. According to the dramatized scenario, both participants understood that neither intended to retreat. George leaned forward once, again, then he raised a question that shifted the discussion from personal experiences to public actions. If leaving the royal family was about protecting your peace, he asked, why did that departure lead to so many high-profile interviews, documentaries, and public projects? The studio fell quiet. It wasn't simply a question about leaving. It was a question about everything that followed. Leaving. But not Quitleman responded by explaining that remaining silent had never been a realistic option. She argued that once negative stories began circulating publicly, she believed she had a responsibility to tell her own side. According to her explanation, speaking out wasn't about revenge. It was about correcting what she viewed as misinformation. She insisted that reclaiming her own narrative was necessary after years of feeling unheard. George listened carefully, then he challenged the premise. He suggested that there is a difference between defending one's reputation and building an ongoing public narrative around personal conflict. He noted that major interviews, streaming projects, books, and public appearances had kept those disputes in the spotlight for years. His question wasn't whether she had the right to speak. It was whether repeated public disclosures transformed a personal story into something much larger. The distinction immediately raised the stakes once again. Truth or narrative? George continued with another observation. According to the scenario, he argued that some details surrounding Meghan's public accounts appeared to evolve over time, not necessarily reversing completely, but expanding, changing emphasis, adding new context while quietly leaving other details behind. He asked whether that reflected natural memory or careful narrative management. Meghan firmly rejected the suggestion. She insisted that her story had remained fundamentally consistent. What had changed, she explained, was her willingness to stop protecting people who, in her view, had never protected her. Early on, she said, she had exercised restraint. Later, she simply became more willing to speak openly. George acknowledged the explanation, but he wasn't entirely persuaded. He suggested that audiences naturally become skeptical whenever important details appear gradually instead of all at once. For journalists, consistency isn't a minor issue. It's central to credibility. A question about motivations. The conversation then moved into its most uncomfortable territory. So far, George carefully chose his next words. He wondered aloud whether the continued public discussion was truly about healing or whether it had become something else entirely. According to the scenario, he suggested another possibility: revenge. The word instantly changed the atmosphere. Meghan stared back in disbelief. She rejected the characterization immediately. She argued that no one would willingly endure years of criticism, global scrutiny, and relentless media attention simply to settle old scores. Her voice reportedly grew more emotional as she described the sacrifices she believed she had made, leaving family relationships behind, walking away from royal duties, starting over under constant public attention. She asked how anyone could interpret that experience as revenge. George answered without hesitation. He proposed that conflict can become commercially valuable. Public sympathy generates attention. Attention creates opportunities, and opportunities can become business. His argument wasn't that personal pain couldn't be genuine. Rather, He questioned whether those experiences had eventually become part of a powerful public brand. The studio reaches its breaking point according to the fictional scenario. This exchange proved to be the emotional tipping point. Meghan abruptly stood from her chair. The movement startled everyone in the studio. Crew members exchanged nervous glances. The cameras continued rolling. He accused George of conducting the interview under false pretenses, instead of an honest conversation. She believed she had walked into an interrogation. George remained seated, his expression barely changed. He calmly replied that difficult questions are part of journalism, especially when public claims have influenced millions of people around the world. For a few tense seconds, neither person spoke. The silence seemed louder than any argument. Then George asked her to sit back down. He said there was one final subject that still needed to be addressed. Meghan hesitated. She appeared ready to leave, but after a long pause, she slowly returned to her seat. Viewers watching the exchange could sense that something significant was about to happen, because George had saved what he considered the most important question for last. And according to the story, that question would ultimately define the entire interview. The final question, according to the dramatized scenario, George waited until Meghan settled back into her chair before asking what he considered the most important question of the entire interview. His voice remained calm, measured, almost conversational, but everyone in the studio understood that this question carried enormous weight. If the events you've described were as serious as you've claimed, he asked, why is there so little documented evidence supporting those allegations? The room fell silent. George clarified what he meant. He wasn't asking whether difficult experiences could happen behind closed doors. He was asking whether formal complaints, official requests, or documented communications existed regarding some of the most serious public claims. After all, institutions of that size generate records, meetings, emails, reports, correspondence. His question centered on documentation, not emotion. Searching for an answer, according to the scenario, Meghan appeared, caught off guard. For the first time during the interview, she struggled to respond immediately. She explained that many important conversations occur privately. People don't record every disagreement. They don't document every uncomfortable interaction. Some experiences leave emotional scars without leaving written evidence. George acknowledged that point. Private conversations certainly exist, but he returned to the distinction between personal experiences and public allegations. He argued that when accusations influence worldwide opinion, audiences naturally expect some form of corroboration beyond personal recollection. His position wasn't that every painful experience requires paperwork. Rather, extraordinary public claims often invite equally extraordinary scrutiny. The debate over proof, the exchange reportedly grew even more serious. George suggested that institutional decisions, particularly those involving official requests or formal procedures, typically generate records somewhere within an organization. If requests for assistance had been formally made, if guidance had officially been denied, wouldn't some documentation likely exist? Meghan responded that family dynamics don't always operate through official channels. Many conversations happen informally, privately, away from written records. She argued that deeply personal experiences cannot always be reduced to paperwork. George understood the distinction, but he emphasized another principle. Once private family matters become public allegations, they inevitably enter the realm of public examination. At that point, journalists and audiences alike begin asking difficult questions. Not because empathy disappears, but because accountability becomes part of the conversation. Experience versus evidence. As the interview reached its climax, George summarized what he believed was the central issue. He acknowledged that lived experiences are deeply personal and deserve respect. But, he argued, personal conviction alone does not automatically establish factual certainty in the public arena. He suggested that journalism requires separating individual belief from independently verifiable evidence whenever possible. According to the scenario, Meghan answered quietly. She maintained that her experiences were real because she had lived them. To her, that personal reality was undeniable. George nodded. Then he offered what became the defining statement of the fictional interview. He explained that personal experience may represent someone's truth, but journalism ultimately seeks the truth, a standard that depends on evidence, consistency, and verification whenever possible. The distinction wasn't intended to invalidate anyone's feelings. It was presented as a reminder of journalism's responsibility when powerful public claims shape national conversations. The closing moments as the discussion came to an end, neither participant appeared entirely satisfied. According to the dramatized narrative, Meghan remained silent for several moments, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. George looked toward the camera and thanked viewers for watching. The interview that had begun as a routine promotional appearance had transformed into something entirely different. Instead of predictable questions and polished answers, audiences had witnessed a difficult debate about memory, accountability, credibility, public responsibility, and the role of journalism itself. Whether viewers agreed with George's questions or sympathized more with Meghan's responses, one thing seemed certain: the conversation left people talking. Supporters praised the persistence of tough questioning. Critics argued that some topics demanded greater sensitivity. Others believed the truth likely existed somewhere between those competing perspectives. And perhaps that's why this fictional scenario continues generating discussion.